July 14, 1944. Somewhere in Normandy, France, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood beside a modified Sherman tank, watching it idle in a field bordered by ancient hedgerows. These earthen walls, some reaching 15 feet high and reinforced by centuries of tangled roots, had stopped the entire Allied advance cold. For 6 weeks, American soldiers had been dying by the thousands trying to cross them. The tank lurched forward at 10 miles per hour. 4 steel tusks, welded crudely to its front hull, bit into the hedgerow. Dirt exploded outward. The Sherman punched through the barrier in seconds, emerging on the other side with its gun level and ready to fire. Bradley watched in awe. The device strapped to that tank's hull was built from German beach obstacles, designed by a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey, and inspired by a joke from a Tennessee soldier that everyone else had laughed at. It would transform the deadliest terrain American forces had ever encountered into open ground for maneuver. Within 11 days, 60% of First Army tanks would carry this modification. Within 2 weeks, the German position in Normandy would collapse entirely. The device cost nothing. It required no special training, and it worked. This is the story of the Culin hedgerow cutter, the field innovation that turned German fortifications into American scrap metal. The Allied planners who designed Operation Overlord made a critical error. They studied the Normandy beaches exhaustively. They analyzed German coastal defenses, calculated tide tables, and rehearsed amphibious landings for months. What they failed to adequately study was what lay just beyond the beaches. The bocage. This Norman countryside, stretching 50 miles inland from the coast, consisted of small, irregular fields bordered by hedgerows. But these were not the decorative hedges of English gardens. Norman hedgerows were fortress walls, built by nature and reinforced by farmers over centuries. Each hedgerow sat atop an earthen embankment averaging 4 feet high. Some reached 15 feet. The banks were packed with interlocking root systems from the trees, bushes, and brambles growing on top. Drainage ditches ran alongside many of them. The fields they enclosed measured no more than 300 feet on any side. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, described the result bluntly. Every small field was a fortress. Every hedgerow was a German strong point. The Germans recognized this immediately. They had 4 years to study the terrain while occupying France. When American forces pushed inland after June 6th, German defenders simply dug foxholes directly into the hedgerow embankments. Their machine guns and mortars had interlocking fields of fire across the small enclosed fields. Their anti-tank weapons covered every gap and opening. American infantry found themselves fighting from field to field, each one a separate battle. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties were catastrophic. The 90th Infantry Division, relatively inexperienced, suffered 150 officers and 2,315 enlisted men killed or wounded during June alone. In July, the division lost another 310 officers and 5,188 enlisted men. A United States Army survey of casualties in the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 25th Infantry Divisions found that rifle companies lost nearly 60% of their enlisted men and over 68% of their officers between June 6th and July 31st. 1,000 killed per kilometer. That was the price American forces paid advancing between La Haye-du-Puits and Lessay. The 79th Infantry Division lost 1 man every 3 meters during the conquest of Montgardon. General Omar Bradley called it the damnedest country he had ever seen. Infantry casualties were appalling, but the situation with armor was arguably worse. American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, with tanks and infantry supporting each other. In the bocage, this coordination became nearly impossible. Tanks could not penetrate the hedgerows. When a Sherman attempted to push through, the earthen bank and root mass simply stopped it cold. The only alternative was to climb over, but this created a fatal vulnerability. As a tank rode up and over a hedgerow, its bow tilted skyward. This exposed the thinly armored underside to enemy fire. German soldiers armed with Panzerfaust, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, waited in the next hedgerow, barely 150 to 400 yards away. The moment an American tank exposed its belly, they fired. Tank after tank was destroyed this way. Crews learned to fear the hedgerows as much as German armor. The narrow, sunken lanes between hedgerows offered no relief. These ancient roads, worn down over centuries of use, trapped tanks in confined spaces where they became easy targets for ambush. Armor that strayed off the roads became stuck. Armor that stayed on roads was predictable and vulnerable. American forces tried several solutions. Combat engineers used explosives to blow holes in hedgerows, but the detonations attracted immediate German artillery and mortar fire. Tanks equipped with bulldozer blades, called dozers, could push through hedgerows with effort, but they were highly visible. German anti-tank squads prioritized them as targets. Every battalion had approximately 70 tanks. Only 4 were dozers. The terrain had neutralized American armored superiority. German tanks, despite being fewer in number and often mechanically unreliable, could hold the roads and wait. American tanks, despite their numerical advantage, could not maneuver. By late June 1944, the Allied advance had stalled. American forces held only 1/5 of the territory originally planned for this phase of the campaign. The beachhead was secure, but breaking out seemed impossible. Sometime in early July 1944, a group of American soldiers sat discussing the hedgerow problem. Among them was a man known only as Roberts, a soldier from Tennessee. According to military historian Max Hastings, Roberts asked a simple question: "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Everyone laughed. The idea seemed absurd. Hedgerows were not bushes. They were earthen walls, reinforced by centuries of root growth. You could not simply cut through in them. But one man did not laugh. Sergeant Curtis Culin III was 29 years old, a tanker with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. Born February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey, Culin had survived the Depression. He knew how to improvise. Where others heard a joke, Culin heard a solution. He grabbed a pencil and started sketching. The beaches of Normandy were still littered with German obstacles. Among them were Czech hedgehogs, anti-tank barriers made of 3 steel I-beams bolted together at right angles. Each beam measured approximately 2.1 meters long and weighed around 240 kilograms. The hedgehogs were designed to stop tanks and landing craft, but after the beaches were secured, they became scrap metal. Culin realized these I-beams could be repurposed. He collected sections of steel from the destroyed obstacles, cut them to length, angled and sharpened the ends, and welded them together into a 4-pronged plow. This assembly would then be welded to the armored transmission casing at the front of a Sherman tank. The principle was simple. Instead of climbing over a hedgerow and exposing the tank's belly, the prongs would bite into the earthen bank at ground level. The tank's weight and engine power would drive the tusks through the root mass. The Sherman would push through the hedgerow on a level keel, emerging with its gun ready to fire. Culin built a prototype and tested it. It worked. Word spread quickly through the 2nd Armored Division. Other units were experimenting with similar ideas. The 79th Infantry Division had a hedge cutter in operation by July 5th. The 19th Corps demonstrated prongs originally, designed for placing explosives. Units within the 5th Corps developed devices called brush cutters and green dozers, but Cullin's design proved the most practical. It was simple to build, required only scrap metal and welding equipment, and could be fitted to existing tanks without modification to the vehicles themselves. On July 14, 1944, the device was demonstrated for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. The demonstration took place at a field somewhere in the American sector. Bradley arrived with several staff officers, including Major General Leonard Giroux. A light tank fitted with Cullen's device waited nearby. A crossbar had been welded to its front hull, with 4 tusk-like prongs protruding forward. The tank backed off and ran head-on toward a hedgerow at 10 miles per hour. Its tusks bored into the wall, the tank's weight pinned down the belly, preventing the vehicle from riding up. The Sherman broke through under a canopy of dirt, emerging on the other side with its gun level and ready. Bradley watched in awe as the hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman bursting through. A second demonstration followed with a full-sized M4 Sherman. The heavier tank duplicated the performance, crashing through the barrier without exposing its underside. The solution had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. Now a sergeant had solved it with scrap metal. Bradley acted immediately. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros of the United States Army Ordnance Department to begin emergency production. Medeiros was sent back to the United Kingdom to have tanks modified before shipping to France. Additional arc welding equipment and crews were transported to France by air. At 6 that evening, units in France discovered they needed more welding equipment. By 8 o'clock, a plane was en route to England. Trucks were waiting at the airstrip when it returned before breakfast the next morning. Production went around the clock. The Culin hedgerow cutter, also called the Rhino device, consisted of steel prongs welded to a crossbar, which was then attached to the front hull of a tank. The prongs were cut from Czech hedgehog beams, specifically steel angle beams or I-beams, measuring approximately 1.8 to 2.1 meters in original length. For the cutter assembly, the steel was cut to shorter lengths, sharpened at the ends, and angled forward. Most designs featured 4 prongs, though variations existed. The crossbar was welded directly to the tank's armored transmission housing, the strongest point on the front hull. Weight varied depending on construction, but the device added minimal burden to the tank. More importantly, it required no modification to the tank's mechanical systems. Any Sherman, Stuart, or M10 tank destroyer could be fitted with the device using only welding equipment. Production numbers reflect the urgency. Between July 15th and July 25th, 1944, over 500 Rhino devices were fabricated in the field. By the eve of Operation Cobra, 60% of 1st Army tanks carried the modification. The official campaign historian states that 3 out of every 5 tanks in the 1st Army mounted the hedge cutter. Available armor for operation. Cobra included 1,269 M4 medium tanks, 694 M5, a 1 light tanks, and 288 M10 tank destroyers. Nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armored Division's vehicles were fitted with the device in preparation for the offensive. The British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, referred to as REME, produced their own version called prongs. Initially, they manufactured 24 units from German beach defenses, but subsequent production shifted to factories in the United Kingdom. 600 Mark I prongs were delivered by August for the Sherman 5. 1,000 Mark II prongs followed for Shermans and M10s. 500 Mark III prongs were manufactured for Cromwell tanks. The Churchill tank, with its heavier armor and different hull design, was not considered to need the prong, though some were. Equipped, nonetheless. If you're finding this deep dive into American field innovation useful, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and ensures you don't miss the next video on American war weapons. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. Bradley had forbidden use of the Rhino tanks before this date to preserve operational security. The Germans had no idea what was coming. The offensive began with the largest carpet bombing in World War II history. 1,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers dropped almost 3,300 tons of bombs between Montreuil and Heberkreven, northwest of St. Lo. 1,000 additional medium-range aircraft and fighter bombers followed. 60,000 incendiary bombs fell on 12 square kilometers of bocage. The bombardment caused friendly fire casualties, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. 111 American soldiers died from their own bombs. Nearly 500 more were wounded, but the German defensive crust was shattered. And now the Rhino tanks moved forward. On the first day, Rhino fitted. Tanks from the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions breached more than 20 hedgerows each in rapid succession. The average penetration time was 2.5 minutes per hedgerow. Armored columns surged forward without the previous delays of explosives or bulldozers. Historian Martin Blumenson describes how tanks with the 2nd Infantry Division, supported by artillery, advanced without infantry for 20 minutes, covering several hundred yards and knocking holes in hedgerows before returning to their starting position. The tanks and infantry then advanced rapidly together before the Fons. Germans could re-establish their defensive positions. By nightfall on July 25th, American forces had reached Marigny. By July 27th, Coutances fell. The German defensive line had cracked. The Rhino tanks gave American armor something it had lacked for 7 weeks: mobility. German tanks remained restricted to the roads. The Panthers and Tigers, despite their superior firepower and armor, could not maneuver through the hedgerows. American Shermans, despite their lighter armor and smaller guns, could now attack from unexpected directions. The breakthrough at the center of the Allied front surprised the Germans completely. While they were distracted by British and Canadian attacks at both ends of the Normandy bridgehead, American armor poured through gaps in their lines. By July 31st, the 19th Corps had destroyed the last forces opposing the First Army. Bradley's troops were finally free of the bocage. The front collapsed. German reinforcements arrived too late and too scattered to form new defensive lines. When American armored columns struck southward toward Rennes, there was no defense in depth. On August 1st, General George Patton's 3rd Army was activated. The war of maneuver had begun. The Culin hedgerow cutter was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It fired no projectiles. It carried no explosives. Yet it proved decisive in breaking the Normandy stalemate. Comparison to alternative solutions. American forces tried several methods to breach hedgerows before the Rhino device became available. Explosive charges worked but attracted immediate German attention. The detonations revealed American positions and invited artillery response. Engineers placing the charges were exposed to enemy fire. Dozer tanks could push through hedgerows with effort, but they were highly visible and became priority targets, with only 4 dozers per battalion of 70 tanks, losing even one significantly reduced breaching capability. Ramming with hollow rods allowed placement of explosives deep in the hedgerow, but the process was slow and still required detonation. The Rhino device eliminated all these problems. It was silent. It was fast. It could be fitted to any tank, not just specialized vehicles. And it worked on the first try. Comparison to German armor. The bocage had neutralized American numerical superiority in tanks. German armor, though fewer in number, held defensive positions that American forces could not flank. The Tiger tank's 88mm gun could penetrate an American tank at 2,500 yards in open terrain, but the bocage reduced engagement distances to 150 to 400 yards. At these ranges, the Sherman's 75mm gun became more competitive, and the Tiger's range advantage disappeared. The Rhino device restored mobility to American armor. Shermans could now approach German positions from unexpected angles. The Tiger's superior firepower meant nothing if American tanks attacked from directions the Germans could not cover. German tanks, lacking equivalent devices, remained road-bound. Their heavier weight made climbing hedgerows even more dangerous than it was for Shermans. The Panther and Tiger could not match American maneuverability in the bocage once the Rhino tanks arrived. British adaptation. The British recognized the value of the American innovation immediately. REME produced over 2,000 prongs for British armor, adapting the design for Sherman's, M10s, and Cromwell tanks. During Operation Bluecoat, a British offensive launched on July 30th to support the American breakout. Churchill tanks equipped with prongs traversed terrain considered impassable to tracked vehicles, German defenders were taken completely by surprise. The British prong differed slightly in design, but followed the same principle. Steel tusks, welded to the front hull, allowed tanks to penetrate hedgerows at ground level without exposing their vulnerable undersides. The Culin hedgerow cutter transformed the Normandy campaign. In the 7 weeks between D-Day and July 31st, American forces suffered over 40,000 casualties for a gain of 20 miles through the bocage. In the week following Operation Cobra, American armor advanced over 100 miles. The numbers tell the story. Over 500 Rhino devices produced in 11 days. 60% of 1st Army tanks equipped by July 25th. 3 out of 5 tanks in the breakout force carrying the modification. 2.5 minutes average to breach a hedgerow. More than 20 breaches per tank on the first day of Cobra. The Germans had 4 years to build the Atlantic Wall. The hedgerows held the Americans for 6 weeks. A sergeant with scrap metal broke both in 11 days. Sergeant Curtis Culin received the Legion of Merit for his invention. He attempted to give credit to Roberts, the Tennessee soldier whose joke had inspired him, but this was forgotten in the publicity surrounding the sight play device. Historian Max Hastings notes that Culin, an honest man, tried repeatedly to share credit, but he became a very American kind of national hero nonetheless. 4 months after his invention, Culin stepped on a landmine in the Hurtgen forest. He lost a leg. When he returned to the United States, he became a salesman for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor. He married Bernice Enright in 1945. They lived in New York City. Curtis Culin died in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, on November 20th, 1963. He was 48 years old. President Dwight Eisenhower mentioned Culin in one of his last addresses as president, speaking to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers on January 10, 1961. There was a little sergeant. His name was Culin, and he had an idea. And his idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel, knives, in front of these tanks, and as they came along they would cut off these banks right at ground level. They would go through on the level keel. They would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while. The biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night, Eisenhower said, were those that knew that this thing worked. July 25, 1944, Normandy, France. The bocage that had cost American forces 40,000 casualties in 7 weeks was about to fall. Sherman tanks, their front hulls bristling with welded steel tusks, advanced toward hedgerows that had stopped every previous attack. The prongs bit into centuries-old earthen walls. Tanks punched through in seconds, emerging on level keels with guns ready. Behind them came infantry, finally able to advance without dying by the thousands in every field. The Germans had built Fortress Europe. They had fortified the beaches with mines and obstacles, the coastline with bunkers and artillery, and trusted the bocage to stop anything that got through. An American sergeant from New Jersey looked at their beach obstacles and saw raw material. He listened to a joke from a Tennessee soldier and heard a solution. He welded scrap metal to the front of a tank and broke the deadliest terrain American forces had ever encountered. The Culin hedgerow cutter was not designed by generals or engineers. It was not manufactured in factories or shipped across the Atlantic. It was built in fields by ordnance crews working around the clock with whatever steel they could find. It cost nothing. It required no special training, and it worked. That was American field innovation in 1944. That was the weapon that turned the Normandy stalemate into the Normandy breakout. The Germans never saw it coming.